to feel my heart burned open wide, till nothing else remains except the fires from which I came. Like parted souls, divided for an age, awe and wonder I'd embrace, and the world anew again. But now this picture from me fades, from still's cold hand there's no reprieve, like the fire in me.
Afternoon, guys. It's the 16th of August 2018. It's just after lunchtime and I'm at the Botanical Gardens in Napier on the hill. I was originally going to be shooting this podcast down at the mouth of the Ahuriri estuary by the yacht club, but what was supposed to be a warm sunny day has become overcast and windy, made flying the drone down there a bit difficult this morning, so I've come to the Botanical Gardens. The title for this podcast is an introduction to laboratory alchemy, and I'll be discussing some important key points about the history of the Western alchemical tradition today. The reason why I want to go back over the history is because when we're trying to define exactly what laboratory alchemy is and what it's trying to achieve, the history of the laboratory tradition plays a big role in determining the definition of those two things. So the first concept that is important to understand about laboratory alchemy is that the old adepts, the guys who actually knew what alchemy was about and who knew how to succeed in carrying out its processes, those old adepts insisted and often discussed in detail a concept about the laboratory process which is key to the whole idea of what alchemy really is, and that is that the alchemical process, the alchemical method, what we call the spagyric process, after the term coined by Paracelsus, that process is based upon the philosophy and theory of what Hermetic alchemists believe the process of creation was. In other words, the process which God is alleged to have put into effect in order to create the world that we live in, that process is mimicked in the alchemical laboratory process. And this is nowhere more obvious than in the great work itself, the process for producing the Philosopher's Stone. So the old adepts regularly repeated the idea that the great work was a model or a mimic of the work of creation itself. And that way, when the laboratory alchemist was carrying out the great work in his laboratory, he saw himself as repeating the same process that God itself used in creating the universe. And in this way, the alchemist believed that as he was studying and learning and increasing the accuracy with which he understood the great work, then he was also at the same time learning and understanding the process of how the universe and this world was created. This is the point in laboratory alchemy. This is the actual point in laboratory alchemy, that by studying it, you come to understand the true nature of reality and how that reality came about. This was the philosophy of the Hermetic alchemists. This is what they believed and taught, and this is the way in which they approached their laboratory process. So what this means is that there is an intimate relationship between the creation myths of ancient cultures and the true and accurate alchemical method, the spagyric mechanism. There is a relationship between the process of creation, and that means the ancient creation myths of various cultures around the world, and the process of alchemy. This is really important first principle concept to grasp about the nature of alchemy, laboratory alchemy itself. And it's important because there is not just one path, one method for producing the Philosopher's Stone. Historically, there are a large number of these processes, and they are all very different from each other. And so one of the first problems that a novice student of alchemy comes across when he first starts studying alchemy is, how is he to tell when he's reading one of the old classic texts which path it is that he is reading about? Because the way each of these paths is described is usually very cryptic. They're veiled in symbolism, metaphor, allegory, and a code type language, which makes it very difficult to understand not only what it is that you're reading, but to tell what part of the alchemical tradition any particular text or its author belongs to. And it's important to sort all this out, because if you don't know what path an author is describing, and usually they just don't come straight out and say, here in this book I'm explaining the Regulus of Antimony path or whatever, you're expected to have enough experience that you can tell from the nature of the descriptions in the text what it is that the alchemist is up to, and therefore what path he is studying and describing. But for a novice, that's not a very easy task. And if you don't know what method it is that you're reading about in any particular text, you soon find as you're going from one text to another that you're becoming very confused, because ideas in different texts conflict with each other quite often. So one of the important things about trying to define the nature of what path it is that you're reading about in any particular text is what kinds of processes the author is describing and the way he's talking about them, as well as the philosophy that he is injecting between the straight laboratory instruction in order to kind of back up his theories and his understanding about what he's teaching. So one of the first things that we can do in order to eliminate texts, traditions and paths in the alchemical tradition which may not be of interest to us, may not be useful to us, or which may be fake descriptions of laboratory alchemy, is to begin with the concept that if the process being described is not a reflection of the process of creation, then there's something immediately wrong with the concepts that the author is describing. So one of the important ideas to begin with when trying to assess what it is we're looking at when we're reading alchemical texts is the idea that there are paths which are fake. There's no argument about that. There are also paths which are historically relatively new, and there are paths which are more chemical than alchemical. In other words, they're not esoteric approaches to alchemy, they're more modern scientific chemical approaches to alchemy. They're not part of the esoteric tradition. In other words, by following those kinds of paths, the ones that are more chemical in nature, you're not actually going to learn anything about alchemy itself. All you're going to learn about is how certain individuals involved in the study of alchemy once saw chemistry in its relationship to alchemy. You're not going to learn Hermetism, you're not going to learn the esoteric side of alchemy by following those chemical paths. And the way that we recognize those chemical paths is that the processes which they teach, as I said previously, have nothing in common with the Hermetic philosophy about the process of creation. So we find, for example, that among all of the individuals who are interested in the study of alchemy, or at least in the practice of laboratory alchemy, for whatever reason, that the ones who are most attracted to the paths which are not hermetic and alchemical and esoteric, the paths which are in fact a very old version of chemistry, the people that are attracted to those kinds of processes and schools of thought are people who themselves also are not interested in the esoteric aspect of laboratory alchemy, and they have no real interest in Hermetism or its philosophy. Those kinds of people have a very chemical approach to alchemy, and whenever they're trying to think about and solve problems in relation to the great work, if you get into discussions with them, those discussions are often an archaic form of discussing chemistry. So in the coming podcasts, one of the first things I'm going to do, apart from explaining the kinds of things that laboratory alchemists do in their laboratory, is I'm going to explain how the old adepts saw the laboratory great work as being a mimic of or model of the process of creation. It's absolutely important to be able to get your head around the idea of what it was that those laboratory alchemists were doing and how they thought about what they were doing that made them believe that what they were thinking and doing was a model of the process of creation, so that you can recognize these ideas for yourself when you're reading texts and be able to therefore sift through the vast volume of old alchemical texts and begin to start saying, well, now I know what class these texts are in here, and these ones over here, I either understand those as well or they're something different, and I can leave that for another time or ignore them. We have to go back in history and look at how things developed in the field of alchemy in order to be able to pinpoint a process or a number of processes which fit into this category of being a model of the process of creation. So we can roughly divide the evolution of laboratory alchemy into two main stages. The stage after strong mineral acids were discovered, and the stage before strong mineral acids were discovered. This is important because it doesn't occur to many people that because strong mineral acids like sulfuric acid, nitric acid, hydrochloric acid, aqua regia, before these things were discovered relatively late in history where alchemy is concerned. And therefore any process which claims to be alchemy and claims to be ancient alchemy, which requires the use of strong mineral acids, historically speaking, that process could only have been invented after the mid to late 700s. This is around the time of Arabic alchemy, before it came into the Western world, before the Crusades, when people like the famous Arab alchemist Jabir were studying alchemy in the Middle and Near East and began to discover mineral acids. So this was in around the mid to late 700s AD. So this is the first thing to understand when trying to classify different paths and where they fit into history, and trying to make decisions about how valuable or not these paths might be. Any path which requires the use of strong mineral acids, especially if that path can't do without strong mineral acids, if they are a key to the process, those paths could only have been invented and then developed after the 8th century, which means that historically, relatively speaking, all those kinds of paths are relatively modern. Then what we know about this concept is that before the 8th century, any path which was accurate, authentic, which actually produced the Philosopher's Stone and existed before the 8th century, all of those paths, historically speaking, had to be able to be successful and produce a Philosopher's Stone without the use of strong mineral acids. And when we are making guesses about what kinds of paths that might include, there are only about 3 or 4 that immediately become obvious. The important ones amongst those are the NITA path, the path that uses atmospheric moisture such as dew, rainwater and such like, and the acetate path, which revolves around the use of acetic acid, which is a very ancient known solvent. It goes way back into history. So all 3 of these paths could have been worked way back into prehistory, further back than 6,000 years from our present time. And they could all be contenders for accurate methods. And then we have to consider, when we're looking at these 3 ancient paths, if that's what they are, which of these paths openly demonstrates itself to be a model of the process of creation. The next thing we have to take into consideration is what history itself, recorded history, tells us about these pre-8th century paths to the stone. And unfortunately, because in the late 3rd century, the Roman Emperor Diocletian systematically went about destroying ancient texts on laboratory alchemy, we have very little historic records before the year 300 remaining to us. But we have one individual called Zosimos of Panopolis, a Greek philosopher, scientist, who in around 300 AD wrote an encyclopedia on chemistry. And that encyclopedia recorded a lot of knowledge about laboratory alchemy going way back before Diocletian's destruction of those ancient texts. So almost all that we know about ancient alchemy before 300 AD comes to us from Zosimos of Panopolis and his encyclopedia on chemistry. And one of the individuals who he quoted, or we assume this is a real individual and that his quotes are in fact actual quotes from earlier texts which were destroyed, was a woman by the name who went by the name Mary the Jewess or Mary the Prophetess, and she was an alchemist, I believe, in Egypt about 100 years before Zosimos, and he quotes her extensively. So we can say with relative accuracy that the oldest references to writings, recorded ideas about laboratory alchemy were the ideas of Mary the Jewess. She is the earliest known individual to have actually practiced laboratory alchemy as alchemists themselves would understand it. There are other claims by the scientific and academic community that there are older texts than those of Zosimos and Mary the Jewess, but none of these texts are strictly speaking alchemy. They are really chemical texts, and a lot of them have to do with metallurgy and with faking precious metals and gems. And while academics and scientists may say that that's what alchemy was about or was originally about, alchemists themselves know that that is not true. While some kosher alchemists may have been involved in faking precious metals and gems, that process, those activities themselves are not alchemy. They are simply a side branch of knowing things about chemistry. So academia's claims about older texts going back into early Greek history and into ancient Egypt, in actual fact, no such texts have survived to modern times. So our authoritative source work about what alchemy was before mineral acids, as far back as we can go in recorded history, came from Mary the Jewess. And the primary process which she talked about was the acetate path. It seems from her writings that she also discussed other methods, but her primary process that she was most interested in and elaborated upon the most was what we today call the acetate path, and which traditionally was called the path of Saturn or the path of the vegetable stone. In this way, it's relatively safe to say that if we're looking for a core process in ancient times, which was a model, seen as a model of the process of creation, which did not involve the use of mineral acids, then the acetate path, or the work of Saturn, is the best candidate for what we might refer to as the oldest method or path that we know about today that is connected with the Western tradition. And I deliberately say connected with the Western tradition because there is no argument that other cultures also had valid ancient paths to the stone, and they could be methods which are like very distinctly different from what we have come to know as the paths which are most well known in the Western tradition. So one of the first ideas that is important to understand about my particular view of Western Hermetic laboratory alchemy, one of the first important ideas is the one we've already discussed about the necessity of an authentic path to be a model of the Hermetic view of creation. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I believe that the acetate path is really the only path that can be reliably said to be a model of the Hermetic view of the process for creation. And that this path is quite arguably an ancient path. It goes back before the earliest records of alchemy that have survived to our time. We know that probably before the beginning of the Christian era, people who were practicing laboratory alchemy and searching for the philosopher's stone were using a version of what today we call the acetate path. So that's the second important thing to understand about my view. I am what is known as an acetate path alchemist. That's my particular view and approach to the study of laboratory alchemy and alchemy in general, not initially because I understood its ancient origins and the way in which it modelled the Hermetic process of creation. I was actually introduced to that path by my teacher, who was introduced to that path by her teacher. So I originally got involved in the study of the acetate path, not from any decision I made personally myself, but simply as a product of my apprenticeship in laboratory alchemy. Then later, the more research I did about the history of alchemy, I came to the conclusion that fortunately I had ended up becoming involved in and studying and therefore learning the most about a path which I believe was one of the earliest valid approaches to what we now call Western Hermetic alchemy. So it's important to understand that about me when you're considering my views on alchemy in the future podcasts. I don't comment on most other paths simply because I don't make a big study of those paths, and therefore I'm not an authority on them, and I'm very careful to only speak about things that I know from my own experience, because I've either studied the theory or because I know facts about the things I talk about based on my experience. So I consider myself to be an acetate path alchemist. That's the only path that I'm interested in, and in the future podcasts primarily that will be the path that I will be explaining and discussing. Because I consider myself an acetate path alchemist, I trace the lineage of the tradition which I am involved in back to a gentleman called Ramon Lull. I'll devote a podcast to him where I'll speak about his history in detail because he's an important individual. Two important alchemists existed at the very beginning of the Western Hermetic tradition, and they were Ramon Lull and a man who goes by the name of Arnold de Villanova. These two gentlemen lived roughly at the same time as each other, and they both were acetate path alchemists, although it's possible that both of them also studied other approaches, but primarily they were acetate path alchemists, and the bulk of their publications, or publications which were based on their writings, discuss the details and the secrets of the acetate path. So it's helpful to understand then that I consider myself to be part of the Lullian tradition, because most of the alchemists that I study and have researched and follow and trust are gentlemen who discuss and present ideas that were first laid down by Ramon Lull, and to a lesser degree by Arnold de Villanova. So that is the third thing to be aware of, and that is that the ideas that I will be presenting are strictly part of the Lullian tradition. They are ideas that began with Lull, historically anyway. Obviously he got these ideas from somewhere else, or he developed his particular flavour of alchemical language himself, but his method was based on something he learned from somewhere else. And that I talk primarily about alchemists who were authors, who were also part of the Lullian tradition. This is an important concept to grasp, because a lot of people who are students of laboratory alchemy have almost no idea about the importance of the role which Ramon Lull played in the development of the Western Hermetic tradition. Very little information that Lull published originally in Latin has been translated into English, so very little is known or studied about Ramon Lull's ideas, but I mean in the source works, but in later centuries in history, other alchemists who were also part of the Lullian tradition elaborated on Lull's ideas and often quoted him, and those ideas were either written in English or translated into English later in history. And so we have actually a large volume of recorded knowledge about Lull's views on the acetate path and the overall tradition that evolved out of his views over the centuries. So I think for now that is pretty much all that I'm going to put in this podcast. It's basically just an introduction to let you know some important key concepts that are the basis of the kinds of ideas that I will be discussing in the following podcasts. Thanks for watching, and I think probably the next podcast, podcast 25, will actually be a bit of a biography of Ramon Lull and a discussion about the core concepts which he presented to the Western world, which became the root foundation of Western Hermetic alchemy.